When Karen takes it too far and calls the cops on a neighbor's Halloween decorations, what starts as a harmless holiday tradition turns into an all-out war, with the entire neighborhood rising up to defend the spirit of fun and community. This isn't just about pumpkins and spooky lights. This is about standing up to unreasonable demands and protecting what makes a neighborhood thrive. Will Karen's overreach ruin the Halloween fun, or will the community band together to teach her a lesson she'll never forget? The peaceful suburban neighborhood had always prided itself on its close-knit community and shared traditions. Every year, as the calendar neared October, the residents eagerly anticipated the arrival of Halloween, a time when creativity and fun ran rampant. One family, the Johnsons, were particularly well known for their over-the-top Halloween decorations. Year after year, they transformed their front yard into a haunted house, complete with lifelike skeletons hanging from trees, eerie fog machines, illuminated ghosts, and creepy sound effects that sent chills down the spine of anyone walking by. It had become one of the neighborhood's most anticipated sights, and families, especially children, flocked to see the display. For many, it was the highlight of the season, adding to the excitement of trick-or-treating and the festive atmosphere that Halloween brought. However, not everyone shared this enthusiasm. Among the neighborhood's residents was Karen, a woman who was known for her meticulous adherence to neighborhood rules and an almost obsessive need to ensure that everything conformed to her rigid sense of order. Where others saw joy and creativity, Karen saw disorder. And when it came to the Johnsons' Halloween display, Karen was particularly bothered. She felt that the elaborate decorations were excessive, too loud, and above all, unsafe. Her complaints were not new. Over the years, Karen had voiced her displeasure about a range of minor issues, from the color of fences to the placement of lawn ornaments. However, the Halloween decorations were different. They were, in Karen's eyes, a disruption to the peace and quiet she believed her neighborhood deserved. The lights were too bright, the sounds too loud, and the skeletons too disturbing for her taste. Karen's perception of Halloween, and indeed the entire neighborhood, was one of order and restraint, not extravagance and excess. This year, she decided she'd had enough. In a move that surprised no one familiar with Karen's track record of complaining, she called the police to report the Johnsons' decorations. She claimed that the setup violated neighborhood codes and posed a public nuisance, arguing that the flickering lights and spooky sounds could be considered a safety hazard, especially for young children or elderly residents. Her reasoning seemed disproportionate, considering the fact that many other houses had similarly decorated their yards in preparation for the holiday. But Karen wasn't concerned with what others were doing. For her, it was about maintaining control, preserving a version of the neighborhood that fit her own preferences. And the Johnsons' exuberant Halloween display didn't fit that mold. What Karen hadn't counted on was the sheer level of support the Johnsons had among the rest of the neighborhood. While Karen's complaints about minor issues over the years had stirred frustration in a few, her attack on the Johnsons' beloved Halloween tradition was the tipping point. The residents were tired of Karen's constant interference, her unsolicited critiques of others' ways of living. She had gained a reputation for being a neighborhood cop, constantly complaining about the smallest of infractions. Now, her interference was threatening something that many in the community cared deeply about: Halloween. The Johnsons weren't the only ones who felt the sting of Karen's complaint. Several other families who had decorated their homes for Halloween were alarmed at the potential consequences of Karen's actions. If she succeeded in getting the police involved, what would stop her from targeting other houses, from taking further issue with the fun and festive spirit that characterized the holiday? The idea of letting one person ruin Halloween for everyone was unacceptable to the rest of the neighborhood. A sense of unity began to grow among the residents, many of whom had participated in the neighborhood's annual Halloween festivities for years. It was more than just about decorations. It was about standing up to Karen's unreasonable demands. As more and more neighbors learned about her complaint, they rallied together not only to support the Johnsons, but to assert their collective right to celebrate the season in their own way. There was a shared sense of injustice. Karen had crossed a line, and the residents were determined not to let her take away something that had been a cherished part of their neighborhood for so long. In response to the complaint, neighbors began to take action. They started decorating their own homes with even more elaborate displays than before, using lights, cobwebs, and skeletons to make a statement. The message was clear. They weren't going to let Karen dictate how they could express themselves or how they celebrated Halloween. In fact, the more Karen tried to assert control, the more determined the neighborhood became to push back. It wasn't just about Halloween anymore. It was about the community's right to enjoy their traditions without fear of judgment or interference. This growing resistance was fueled not only by the neighborhood's shared desire to maintain the Halloween tradition, but also by a deeper sense of frustration with Karen's ongoing behavior. The Johnsons' decorations, while elaborate, were not harming anyone. They were a source of joy for children, a piece of nostalgia for adults, and a bonding moment for families. Yet Karen saw them as a threat, something that needed to be controlled. In her mind, Halloween was not a time for excess, it was a time for quiet, order, and conformity. As more neighbors began to decorate their homes in solidarity, it became clear that this was no longer just about the Johnsons' display. It was about the neighborhood's right to maintain its own character, its own sense of fun and community. The stage was set for a confrontation. Karen had made her move, but the neighborhood was united in their response. The fight for Halloween had begun, and it wasn't going to be an easy one. This was no longer just a matter of decorations. It had become a battle for control for the soul of the neighborhood. Would Karen's complaint succeed in tearing the community apart, or would the residents stand strong and push back against her efforts to dictate how they could enjoy one of the most beloved holidays of the year? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. The neighborhood was not going to take this challenge lying down. The fight for Halloween had just begun, and it would change the dynamic of the neighborhood forever. Karen's decision to call the police about the Halloween decorations set in motion a series of events that would escalate tensions in the neighborhood. What started as a minor complaint about decorations grew into a larger, more divisive issue, one that pitted community rights against individual control. Karen's actions did not go unnoticed, and soon the entire neighborhood was aware of her complaint. The consequences were far-reaching, as Karen's seemingly small issue with the Johnsons' Halloween display soon morphed into a battle over the very spirit of the community. The Johnsons, who had been decorating their home for Halloween for over 10 years, were caught off guard by Karen's complaint. They had always been known for their generosity and sense of community. Their Halloween displays weren't just for show, they were a staple of neighborhood life. Year after year, they had hosted small parties, invited neighbors to participate in the decorating, and created an environment of fun and creativity that everyone, young and old, looked forward to. The Johnsons believed in fostering a sense of togetherness and celebration, and their annual Halloween decorations were a testament to that. For years, the neighbors had joined in on the excitement. Children eagerly awaited the haunted house setup. Adults admired the ingenuity of the decorations, and the Halloween block parties were a source of community pride. But suddenly, this tradition was under threat. Karen, who had always been vocal about maintaining order and structure in the neighborhood, found the Johnsons' display to be too much. She saw the bright lights, the eerie sound effects, and the spooky decorations as a nuisance. To Karen, this was a disruption to the quiet, peaceful atmosphere she envisioned for her neighborhood. Her decision to call the police was not just an isolated complaint. It represented a deeper belief in maintaining control, a belief that the neighborhood's activities should align with her rigid standards. Karen's call to law enforcement was an attempt to forcefully impose her vision of how the neighborhood should operate. She argued that the decorations violated local codes, that the lights were too bright, and that the sounds disturbed the peace. However, to the majority of the residents, this complaint seemed like a gross overreach, and they were unwilling to let Karen dictate how they celebrated their holidays. The Johnsons were not the only ones to feel the sting of Karen's complaint. As news of the police involvement spread, other residents who had also decorated their homes for Halloween began to worry that they too might be targeted. The neighborhood had always been a place where residents were free to express their creativity, and Halloween was a time for that expression to shine. But now, with Karen's actions looming over them, the joy and fun that Halloween usually brought started to feel like it was being stolen away. People who had never considered questioning the decorations were now on edge, wondering if their own displays were next in line to face Karen's scrutiny. The tension grew as Karen's complaint began to sour the holiday spirit. Halloween, which should have been a time of excitement, joy, and community togetherness, had now become the focal point of a neighborhood dispute. Residents who had long been content to let the Johnsons lead the charge in Halloween festivities were now feeling the weight of Karen's interference. The more Karen pushed her agenda, the more residents rallied around the idea that they would not allow one individual to control how they celebrated their traditions. This growing sense of unity among the neighborhood residents led to a spontaneous and powerful form of resistance. Rather than backing down, many residents decided to decorate their homes with even more fervor than before. They put up extra lights, added additional skeletons, and created even more elaborate displays to show their defiance. It became clear that the decorations were not just about Halloween anymore. They were a stand against Karen's attempt to impose her views on the entire neighborhood. What was once a neighborhood full of shared traditions was now split into two factions. On one side were Karen and a few like-minded neighbors who believed in rigid rules and minimal disruption. They were the ones who wanted to curb the festive energy that had always characterized Halloween in the community. On the other side were the majority of the residents who felt that Karen had overstepped her bounds by bringing law enforcement into a matter that should have been resolved within the community. These residents saw Karen's actions as an attack on a long-standing neighborhood tradition that fostered creativity, joy, and connection. The divide grew clearer as the days passed. Residents who had once been passive in their support of Halloween decorations now became active participants in the rebellion against Karen's complaints. They decorated their homes even more elaborately, creating a stunning array of spooky displays that could not be ignored. Some residents went so far as to share their plans on social media, using hashtags like hashtag Halloween is for everyone and hashtag Karen can't stop us to show solidarity and spread the message of resistance. The message was unmistakable. The neighborhood would not let Karen's demands dictate their traditions. Halloween was not just a holiday, it was a reflection of their community's spirit. It was about creativity, fun, and shared experiences, values that Karen's complaint seemed to disregard entirely. What started as a complaint about a few lights and sounds had snowballed into a much larger confrontation about the values of the neighborhood. The battle lines had been drawn, and Karen had unwittingly united the community in a way that no one could have predicted. As the Halloween decorations grew more extravagant and the neighbors banded together, it became clear that this was no longer just about one complaint. It was about preserving the essence of a neighborhood. Residents who had been content to let things slide for years now found themselves motivated to fight for their right to celebrate in their own way. They weren't just decorating, they were sending a message. Halloween wasn't just a holiday. It was a community tradition that no one would let Karen or anyone else take away. The war for Halloween had begun. What was once a fun, family-oriented tradition was now a battleground for the neighborhood's values and its sense of identity. And it wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about standing up for what they believed in, defending their right to celebrate, and showing that the spirit of community couldn't be easily crushed by one person's desire for control. The stage was set for a showdown, and the neighborhood was ready for whatever came next. As Karen's complaint continued to simmer, the residents of the neighborhood decided that they could no longer remain passive in the face of her constant interference. The simple act of calling the police over Halloween decorations had sparked something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. The Johnsons, who had been the initial targets of Karen's complaint, were understandably upset, but the response from the rest of the community was both immediate and forceful. They were tired of living under the cloud of Karen's complaints, and they knew that if they let this one slide, it would only be a matter of time before Karen turned her attention to other harmless neighborhood traditions. What made this situation different from the many small complaints Karen had lodged in the past was the fact that it involved Halloween, a tradition that transcended individual homes. Halloween had always been more than just a holiday. It was a time for the entire neighborhood to come together. It was a time when neighbors helped each other decorate their homes, shared candy, and took part in festive gatherings. For the Johnsons, their annual Halloween display had become a beloved fixture, a symbol of creativity, community, and fun. But now it was under threat from Karen's relentless drive to enforce what she saw as order. The neighborhood wasn't about to let Karen dictate how they celebrated. They quickly rallied together in defense of their right to enjoy the season. In retaliation, the decorations around the entire neighborhood began to grow more extravagant. Some families, who had once put up simple displays of pumpkins and cobwebs, went all out. Yards transformed into haunted mansions, front porches became scenes from classic horror movies, and entire houses were draped in glowing lights, tombstones, and life-size skeletons. The more Karen attempted to shut down the fun, the more determined the residents became to turn their neighborhood into the most festive and spirited place for Halloween. For the Johnsons, the support they received from the community was overwhelming. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now rallied behind them, offering help with decorations, donating extra lights and props, and even volunteering to set up haunted house elements. It wasn't just about supporting the Johnsons, it was about standing up for a tradition that brought the neighborhood together. The community was sending a clear message. They would not let one person's objections destroy the spirit of Halloween. What began as a local dispute quickly gained momentum. Social media platforms were flooded with photos and videos of the neighborhood's increasingly elaborate Halloween decorations, with residents proudly showcasing their work and tagging each other using hashtags like hashtag Halloween in the neighborhood and hashtag Karen Can't Stop Us. The backlash grew louder with each passing day. Local news outlets, sensing a story with wide appeal, picked up on the growing controversy and ran with it. Some outlets called it the Great Halloween Battle, covering the story of a community fighting back against one person's attempt to ruin a cherished holiday tradition. The story went viral, drawing attention from people both within and outside of the neighborhood. This new attention only fueled the resistance. As more people saw what was happening, more neighbors joined the movement, creating an even more spectacular display of unity. What had started as a small protest against one woman's complaints had turned into a powerful demonstration of community spirit. People who had never spoken to each other before were now sharing tips on decorations, exchanging recipes for Halloween-themed treats, and coordinating costumes for the upcoming block party. The neighborhood had gone from a collection of individual houses to a united front, a force to be reckoned with. The neighborhood organizers, a group of longtime residents who had always helped coordinate local events, took it a step further. They released a public letter to the entire neighborhood, inviting everyone to join in the Halloween celebrations and making it clear that Karen's complaints would not be allowed to overshadow the festivities. The letter emphasized that the event was not about creating division, but about standing up for the freedom to express creativity and celebrate tradition. The tone of the letter was firm but respectful. This was not a war of animosity, but a collective stand for the values that had always defined the neighborhood: fun, unity, and creativity. The letter also invited Karen to join in the festivities, extending an olive branch in an attempt to show that the community was not fighting her personally, but rather the principle of her actions. The invitation was a bold statement. The neighborhood was not about to let one individual ruin the spirit of Halloween, but they were open to dialogue and hoped that Karen would recognize the value in coming together to celebrate rather than divide. The response to this open invitation was overwhelming. People took to social media, posting photos of their own Halloween displays with messages of solidarity for the neighborhood and their fight for Halloween freedom. The hashtag Join the Celebration began trending in the community, and local businesses started to offer discounts on Halloween decorations, providing support for the neighborhood's pushback. Karen, however, was unmoved. Her refusal to join the celebrations only solidified the community's resolve to continue the fight. In a short time, the neighborhood's Halloween celebration became more than just a simple holiday event. It became a symbol of resilience, community solidarity, and the right to preserve traditions. For the residents, it wasn't just about the decorations. It was about standing up for what was right, about refusing to let one person's desire for control dictate how an entire neighborhood lived. The Halloween displays grew bigger and more elaborate, and on the night of the block party, the entire street was transformed into a stunning, eerie wonderland filled with laughter, music, and excitement. Despite Karen's initial complaints, the neighborhood's spirit was unbroken. The success of their Halloween celebration was a clear statement. No one could take away the joy and creativity that defined their community. The residents proved that when they stood together, they were stronger than any one person's attempts to impose their will. And so, the neighborhood not only saved Halloween, it strengthened the bonds that held them together, creating a deeper sense of connection and pride than ever before. As the Halloween season progressed and the neighborhood continued to rally around its decorations and traditions, Karen's efforts to control the situation intensified. The once festive displays had become a source of fierce resistance against her, and with every new decoration that went up, Karen felt her control slipping further away. She had already made one call to the police, which had been met with a degree of indifference. But in Karen's mind, the situation had only worsened, and she was convinced that something needed to be done to stop what she saw as an increasingly chaotic environment. In her eyes, the situation was no longer just about a few colorful lights and plastic skeletons. It had become a violation of her sense of order and safety. The sheer volume of decorations in the neighborhood was overwhelming, and Karen began to feel like she was surrounded by a sea of distractions. Her concern, which had once been limited to the Johnsons' house, now extended to the entire block. In a final attempt to regain control, Karen again picked up the phone and called the police, arguing that the decorations were no longer just an aesthetic issue but a serious safety hazard. She claimed that the large amounts of lights, inflatable figures, and towering skeletons created a fire risk, hindered visibility for drivers, and blocked walkways. In addition to these safety concerns, Karen once again invoked the potential violations of local zoning laws. She argued that the sheer scale of the decorations exceeded what was permissible under the neighborhood's code, suggesting that the homes had transformed into something more akin to theme parks than residential properties. For Karen, it was a matter of maintaining order and adhering to what she believed were the community's established guidelines. The idea that the neighborhood had descended into chaos with over-the-top displays was something that she could no longer tolerate. She felt personally responsible for ensuring that these excessive decorations were reined in before the situation got any worse. But when the police arrived on the scene this time, the situation unfolded very differently than it had in the past. The officers had already responded to the initial complaint and were well aware of the community's ongoing support for the Johnsons and their decorations. As the officers walked through the neighborhood, they saw the elaborate Halloween setups, glowing lights, spooky sound effects, inflatable ghosts, and creatively decorated lawns. To them, it was clear that while the decorations were certainly elaborate, they posed no immediate threat to public safety. The officers acknowledged Karen's concerns, but explained that the decorations were, by and large, harmless. They pointed out that the lights were properly set up, the walkways were clear, and there were no evident safety violations that would warrant intervention. In fact, the decorations appeared to be safely executed, and the community seemed to be enjoying them. The officers gently explained to Karen that Halloween decorations were not a law enforcement issue unless there was a clear violation of safety codes or a direct risk to public safety. They assured her that they had no reason to believe that the decorations posed such a risk. The idea of banning or restricting the decorations seemed excessive to them, especially considering the joy they were bringing to the residents of the neighborhood. The officers suggested that Karen work through her concerns with her neighbors in a more collaborative manner rather than involving law enforcement. For Karen, this was an affront. She had expected the police to back her up and take action, but instead, she was met with an outcome that only deepened her frustration. She was adamant that the decorations were too extreme and that they needed to be stopped, but the officers had made it clear that her personal opinions were not sufficient grounds for police involvement. For Karen, This rejection of her concerns felt like a personal failure. She had spent weeks trying to get the neighborhood to conform to her vision of order, and now, with the police essentially dismissing her concerns, it felt as if her control over the situation was slipping away. This was a turning point for the rest of the neighborhood. However, with the police now clearly siding with the majority of the residents, the community's resolve was strengthened. It was clear that Karen's attempts to involve the authorities were not only futile, but were also seen as an overreach. The police's decision to remain neutral and encourage communication instead of escalating the issue was a major victory for those who had been decorating their homes and standing in solidarity with the Johnsons. The neighborhood saw the police's involvement as an endorsement of their right to enjoy their holiday traditions. The officers' decision reinforced the idea that the decorations were not a legitimate cause for concern, further discrediting Karen's claims and putting her on the defensive. As Karen's complaints continued to fall flat, the community rallied behind the idea of celebrating Halloween with even more gusto. The absence of police intervention signaled that the law was on their side, and the idea of canceling or scaling back the decorations was no longer a possibility. This newfound confidence in the neighborhood's support brought about a surge of energy. The block party plans became even more elaborate, with residents working together to turn the entire street into a Halloween wonderland. Families began sharing recipes for spooky treats, organizing costume contests, and setting up interactive games for the children. The sense of unity was palpable. What had started as a small protest against one woman's complaints had evolved into a full-blown celebration of community spirit and resilience. The residents were no longer just standing up for their right to decorate. They were defending a tradition that had brought them closer together over the years. As the Halloween celebration loomed closer, it became clear that Karen's attempts to enforce her vision of a quiet, orderly neighborhood were not going to succeed. The community had proven that their traditions and their right to celebrate were far more important than one individual's objections. And with the police stepping back and leaving the issue to be resolved through communication and understanding, Karen's control over the situation seemed weaker than ever. The residents, now united and emboldened by the support they had received, were determined to throw the biggest, most spirited Halloween celebration the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen's move to escalate the situation by calling the police had only backfired. It had united the neighborhood, and in doing so had ensured that this Halloween would go down in history as a triumph for community solidarity. The decorations, once a point of contention, now served as a symbol of resistance, creativity, and unity. And while Karen might have thought she could stifle the neighborhood spirit, she had only fueled the fire of celebration. As Halloween night approached, the tension in the neighborhood had reached a boiling point. What had started as a series of disagreements over Halloween decorations was now the focal point of a much larger battle, the fight for community spirit versus one person's attempt to impose their rigid control. Despite Karen's best efforts to stifle the holiday celebration, the residents were more determined than ever to ensure that Halloween remained a time for fun, creativity, and unity. What had once been a small neighborhood tradition had now grown into a massive, all-out celebration that no one could ignore. As the sun began to set on Halloween night, the entire block came alive with lights and excitement. The streets were aglow with pumpkins carved into intricate designs, their flickering candles casting eerie shadows along the sidewalks. Elaborate decorations adorned every home, from towering skeletons that greeted visitors to ghostly figures that swayed in the trees. The once quiet neighborhood had transformed into a Halloween wonderland, each house adding its own unique touch to the festive atmosphere. The air was filled with the sounds of spooky music and the laughter of children eager to go trick-or-treating. Despite Karen's repeated complaints, the block party went on as planned. It had grown from a small gathering into an event that drew people from outside the neighborhood as well. Families, friends, and even strangers from nearby areas had heard about the spectacle and were eager to see the neighborhood's creative displays. Cars lined the streets, and people walked from house to house, marveling at the decorations, taking photos, and soaking in the festive spirit. The Halloween block party had become the event of the season, and no one was going to let Karen's objections ruin it. For the residents, this was a victory of community over control. The decorations weren't just about the lights or the spooky effects. They represented something far more significant. The decorations were a symbol of the neighborhood's identity, of its sense of togetherness, and of its resistance against anyone who sought to dictate how they should live. What had started as a small act of defiance against one person's objections had become a powerful statement about the strength of community spirit. Karen, however, was nowhere to be found in the midst of the festivities. As the night wore on, she remained on the sidelines, unable to participate in the very event she had tried so hard to stop. She had spent weeks trying to bring down the Halloween celebration, but now she found herself completely isolated, standing at the edge of it all, watching as the neighborhood came together in a show of solidarity. The more she stood apart, the more it became clear that the community had moved on without her. Her attempt to impose control had only made the neighborhood stronger and more united. At first, Karen had believed she could stop the decorations with a simple phone call to the police. When that didn't work, she had doubled down on her efforts, trying to convince her neighbors to see things her way. But despite her repeated complaints, the residents refused to back down. They understood that their right to celebrate, to express themselves, and to come together as a community was more important than one person's desire for conformity. As the Halloween night unfolded, it became increasingly clear that Karen's influence over the neighborhood had all but evaporated. For the rest of the community, Halloween had become a night of celebration. Not just of the holiday, but of their shared values. The block party wasn't just about Halloween decorations. It was about the joy of coming together as a neighborhood, of creating something beautiful and exciting that everyone could enjoy. The decorations, the costumes, the games, and the shared meals were all part of a larger story. A story of people refusing to let one individual spoil their happiness, their traditions, and their sense of unity. The sense of community was palpable as neighbors worked together to ensure that the evening was a success. The Johnsons, who had originally been the target of Karen's complaints, had found themselves at the heart of the festivities. They were surrounded by friends, neighbors, and even families they hadn't spoken to in years, all of them celebrating together. It was a powerful reminder of what a tight-knit community could achieve when it stood united. The Johnsons' Halloween display, which had once been the focal point of the conflict, had become a symbol of resistance, of standing up for the right to celebrate without fear of judgment or control. As the night drew to a close, the spirit of the neighborhood remained strong. The last trick-or-treaters made their rounds, children with wide eyes and candy-filled bags, their laughter echoing down the street. Neighbors shared stories and jokes as they handed out candy, their voices full of warmth and camaraderie. For the residents, this was the culmination of weeks of effort, a celebration of their resilience, creativity, and the bonds that held them together. For Karen, Halloween night was a bitter pill to swallow. She had tried to impose her will on the neighborhood, believing that her vision of order and quiet would prevail. But in the end, it was the residents who had triumphed, proving that community spirit cannot be easily undone. Halloween had not only been saved, it had become a symbol of the neighborhood's collective strength and refusal to be controlled by one individual's objections. The final showdown between Karen and the neighborhood was not just about Halloween, it was about the values that the neighborhood held dear. It was about standing up for one another, about celebrating traditions, and about protecting the joy that came from coming together as a community. The battle may have started over decorations, but it ended with a powerful reminder that the true spirit of a neighborhood lies in its people and their ability to stand together in the face of adversity. As the lights dimmed and the last of the Halloween revelers headed home, the neighborhood was left with a sense of accomplishment and pride. Halloween had not just been saved, it had been redefined. And in doing so, the community had reminded everyone that sometimes the things worth fighting for are the simple pleasures of life, the right to celebrate, the right to be heard, and the right to stand together against anyone who would try to take that away. Join the movement. Subscribe now and never miss a moment of the most epic neighborhood showdowns.